This episode is part of the Utopia podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
My name is Tamara Cvetković, and I'm here with my co-host Samriddhi. Our guest is a very interesting person, our colleague, a researcher, a writer, and a cultural manager from Ukraine, Eugenia Seleznova. And we're gonna talk about her work and life today because they're intertwined. So please welcome Eugenia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me.
Eugenia, we are so happy to have you here. And why don't we begin by you introducing yourself?
I'm a writer, author. I've been writing for past almost 30 years. I started really early as a kid yet. And I've had several twists in my life, let's say. Initially, my very first educational background is a degree in, let's say, natural sciences. And it is a part of my life that I do not really like to talk about for many reasons. And when I was 25, I left that sphere entirely. And my plan was actually, my hope was to become a visual artist. I was doing a part-time bachelor degree in fine arts and I completed it. But then it appeared that people are much more willing to pay and they actually want much more whatever I am writing, not whatever I'm drawing. So I started working first as a copywriter's assistant, basically writing some copywriting texts, very generic topics like how to change winter tires on your auto or whatnot, stuff like this. And then after a few months of doing this, I basically shifted to cultural journalistics. I have worked as a cultural journalist for a certain period of time. And yes, and after that there were jobs in editing. I was the chief editor of 2 media projects, cultural management. I was the communication manager and media coordinator at Odessa National Fine Arts Museum. And Odessa, I forgot to mention this, is my home city in Ukraine. Yes, for past 8 years already I've been doing everything connected to texts and writing. And already in the pandemic, I started my career how do I say that? Like a proper writer. I started my own book projects and I have a kid's book published. It's a nonfiction about immunity, germs and vaccines. And one more published in an anthology.
So can you please tell us who is Sonia Zelena and what does she do?
Okay, so Sonia Zelena is a Ukrainian kids writer, emerging. She has a book and 1 text in an anthology published by now, but she hopes to publish some more fiction works soon because her first book is a non-fiction for kids about vaccines and immunity and germs. And it was actually it did quite good. It made it to a long list of BBC Ukraine kids books of the year 2022. And she also has another text published in an anthology about Ukrainian female warriors. Yeah. And Sonia Zelena is also my pseudonym for kids literature. When I started writing for kids, there were several reasons why I considered taking a pseudonym. First of all, because I'm a queer person, and as a journalist, I've been working a lot with queer topics. And I was concerned about, how is this going to work together? Like kids literature and obvious queerness, my master's was on, that was before my master's. But anyway, I've been working with LGBTQI plus topics quite a lot. So I wanted to separate my writings for kids and my adult writings. Another reason is that my actual surname, Seleznova, it's considered to be Russian sounding because it ends with ova, and it's how Russian surnames are made. And back then, in 2021, I still was concerned that someone might take me for a Russian author. because there were plenty of them in Ukrainian book market. And the final reason is that I have quite a backstory with my surname. It's not something that I've been like bearing across generations of my family from whatever ancient times. This surname was given to my grandfather back in 1920s when he was homeless, lost a parentless child in what was then like emerging as USSR. And there were millions of kids in this situation back then. And when he was accepted to an orphanage, he did not remember his real surname because he was too little. And he was given this surname. And in Russian, Seleznova means of drakes, birds. Because when they were doing the procedure, the principal of this orphanage looked out of the window and a flock of drakes was flying by, and he was like, okay, this boy goes by Seleznov. And it's actually quite, I would say, okay option, because back then, like, people were given surnames of Komsomol, of proletarian, or whatnot. Like, these were actual surnames that people spend then their lives with. And mine is neutral nature related, but still it feels like a sort of a stamp of this very cruel time that my grandfather was born to. It's a stamp of this historical trauma my family has gone through on the father's side. And I wanted to get rid of it. I didn't want it on the covers of my books, so I consider taking a pseudonym. I'm not sure if I will keep it now, actually, because I'm gradually also starting to hope to publish some adult stuff in Ukrainian as well. Like, I have some agreements on works and books that might come out in following years. And I'm not sure if I will keep bearing this Sonia Zelena with me, because maybe after all the literature character of Eugenia Seleznova might appear more wholesome.
And now you started a lot of interesting topics. You told us something about background of your family, but also you mentioned your identity and different layers of it. Can you please tell us, because we are in this podcast, we are talking with the transnational authors. So maybe you can tell us something about your own background and why we consider you a transnational author.
Okay. So I would say I have a lot of different transitionings throughout my life, identity, career. First of all, I'm not sure even where do I start, because they are so entangled. And yes, I'm not sure what was. First of all, I had this career shift when I dropped my natural sciences background and switched to art and literature. And more or less at the same time, I switched my sexual identity, because around that same time, I stopped having heterosexual relationships and I went into full-blown lesbianism. Yes. Yeah, it was around the same time. And a bit later, I had a language transitioning, because initially I was a Russian-speaking person. Like, I was raised in a Russophone surroundings. My parents were and still are and maybe will always be Russian-speaking people, and everyone around was speaking Russian. But then I think it was already by 2019, sometime around that, when I started writing in Ukrainian.
Maybe can you give us a little bit of background so that our audience can understand the situation? Odessa is in Ukraine, but it is a Russian-speaking area. So actually, Ukrainian language is, if I understand correctly, your language of schooling or your sort of second language. Maybe you don't disagree with me, but maybe you can explain that a bit more.
Yeah, so we have this very complex issue with languages. Part of Ukrainian regions, they were heavily Russified like 100 years ago, and Ukrainian language was eradicated by many means. And it was even that happened even before the Soviet Union. It's a very long, 100 years old story. But what we finished up with is that Odessa was a primarily Russophone region. And yes, I was happy. I was lucky enough to learn good Ukrainian at my school. But when I was growing up, and it was like 2000s, Ukrainian language, even though we learned it, it was very unprestigious. Like, it was considered a rural language. And if you were talking Ukrainian anywhere on the street, like, someone could actually come up and ask, are you from the countryside or what? And yeah, and we grew up with that attitudes. And like, I learned Ukrainian mechanically at school. I was lucky enough because like our principal teacher, like, was responsible for our whole class. She was a teacher of Ukrainian language and literature, coming from Lviv, which is considered like naturally Ukrainian-speaking language on the western part of the country. And yes, and like when I was very young, I despised Ukrainian myself, but I learned it. And now I'm very happy about it because I can actually write and speak, even though it's not perfect. Like, it's still my learned language. I'm doing, like, I can do some mistakes in some very nuanced things. Yes, but I do speak it and I can write it. And in these terms, it's much easier for me than for some people who never learned it and in the literature process. And now they face it that their works in Russian simply will not be published anywhere in Ukraine.
How has your relationship with Ukrainian changed over the years? Like, you were mentioning that it used to be this learned language, a very mechanical language. But what were the circumstances that led to you adopting Ukrainian? Was it just you wanting to make it as a writer in Ukraine? Or was it something else that made you like fall in love with the language and make it the language of your creative expression?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think okay, first of all, of course, I had this 10 years of throughout exposure at my school. And then I had a story, like, I had the love story. I was in love with someone who was already back then, who somehow acquired a Ukrainian nationalist identity, which did not happen often in our southern regions at all back then. And I'm not sure how it happened to them, but anyway, like, this person was Ukrainian nationalist, this person switched to Ukrainian, and it was a long-distance relationship. I've spent like several hours on the phone with this person, like most of the days, and we were talking in Ukrainian about everything, like all the topics that you never have covered at school. And when I was not talking to him, I was miserable and listening to Ukrainian love songs from some of our bands because they suddenly became very relatable for me. And I think that's when I have gotten this emotional background for Ukraine, because suddenly it became a language in which I loved. I did not switch to speaking Ukrainian in 2014 when our war started, like many people did. I did not. I kept speaking Russian. I kept writing in Russian. And I think I started switching more consciously around 2019-ish. I started consciously buying and reading more books in Ukrainian because I realized that my vocabulary is limited and I wanted to make it better. And then when I was working in the museum already, we had, like, a law was introduced that we were obliged to communicate with visitors in Ukrainian because this is a state language. And I was also doing the guided tours from time to time, and I wanted to do it good, of course. And yes, that's when I started training my, like, oral Ukrainian skills. And yes, and then the full-scale invasion, my partner and I, we moved to Vienna. And at some point, I realized that, okay, there are plenty of Ukrainians in the city, but there are also plenty of Russians. And when I hear Russian language on the streets, I never know who is talking. And so some days it would make me tense and triggered. And when I had such a bad day, I realized that when I myself am speaking Russian in public, I might give someone that pain and I do not want it. And yeah, my partner and I, we just like, one day we just switched to Ukrainian and we never switched back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a sort of personal and political decision.
Yes, and also I would say from my side it was an act of care, because I realized that I will better like it's not that much about representation and fear of being like confused with the Russian, but it's actually an act of care for someone who might be triggered every time they hear Russian, because there are plenty of people, like, for example, people who escaped occupation.
I understand.
They're very triggered, yeah.
Now, you mentioned different kinds of transitioning in your life. So I was wondering, like the transitioning from Ukraine to Austria to Vienna created some sort of change in your life. And you also pretty soon decided to start your studies at Central European University and to deal with queer topics. Can you tell us a bit more about these different transitionings that happened to you when you moved to Vienna? And something about your studies and your work on LGBTIQ topics.
Okay, where do I start? My transitions when I came to Vienna. I mean, like your whole life becomes extremely transitional and liminal when you're moving under circumstances like this. And it's interesting because, like, in the very initial phases of this, you feel at the same time like very powerless, because no one, you can nothing, you don't know like the language that people speak on the streets and none. But also it was liberating, because like from this, in my age, again I was in my early 30s when we moved, you can basically go almost anywhere. Like you have so many things open in front of you and you do not owe anyone anything. And yes, it was a bit unexpected even for myself that I ended up in this master's program at CU. It was almost accidental. I was actually, I was doing some job interviews in a nursing home when I have learned that CU offers a year of free studies to Ukrainian students. And I decided to apply just in case, so that I am not sorry later that I have not done something for myself. And I applied, and I decided applying for gender studies because I was already interested a lot with queer and LGBTQI plus topics. And I had this long-running interest, like, how comes people are actually homophobic? How comes people are hostile towards LGBTQI plus people? Like, why does it matter so much? And and I checked the CU programs, and I checked the gender studies curriculum, and there was queer theory there. And I'm like, okay, why not? I applied, and I received a spot. So I started my studies.
So how did gender studies add to how you were viewing the world, or how did it change? Like, what was your experience of starting a master's program in gender studies?
First of all, my experience was that I'm definitely having some audio processing struggles and issues. I think also because I'm neurodivergent, self-diagnosed. Like I had some time that I was getting used to everyone's accents and people not actually having subtitles that I turn on when I'm watching Netflix. Yeah, and yes, it was of course very fulfilling in many ways, but also in some ways disappointed because I have not gotten the answers to all the questions that I was coming with.
Yes.
There are no answers. There is no, like, I was yearning in my very natural science positivist way of thinking for a very concrete answer as to why people are homophobic. But no answer like this exists. Yes. Yeah, I have finally mastered reading academic papers, because that was something that I was struggling with all along before. Like, when I was doing this media project, which was like, I had a media project back in Ukraine where we tried popularizing scholarly findings, talking about them in a very accessible way and spreading like Ukrainian scholars' findings. But then I was very much struggling with reading like actually academically written papers. And now I finally mastered the skill. Yeah, what else I was going to say? Yes, I did this master's work on sense of belonging in LGBTQI plus Ukrainians, because that was something that was puzzling me all way long. Like, why some people, some queer Ukrainian people do feel a lot of affinity to Ukrainian nationhood, to Ukraine itself, even though like they are deprived of so many rights in this country, in this society, and others do not. And I was wondering, because I even had this contrast like with myself and my partner, because my partner, like she had a lot of affinity to Ukrainianhood, and I felt like I was not fitting even before the war and before we had to leave. And I wanted to figure out like why such contrast. So I did my master's about that. And now I am developing my doctoral project, which kind of continues this work, but makes it much more like all-encompassing, let's say so.
You mentioned the portal for, let's say, public scholarship. That is Prostranstvo Media, if I'm right. So can you tell us something more about your work there? You already said that you wanted to make, let's say, scientific texts accessible to wider audience and to, let's say, democratize it in a sense. What are your thoughts about that now? You were the co-founder of the portal, am I right?
Yes, I was like founder, chief editor, have developed the whole concept and structure. We struggled with getting audience, we struggled with actually popularizing the project itself. It was very interesting, it was very demanding. We were like, yes, we tried to gather people from different fields of knowledge. We had our 4 directions were like hardcore theory, like philosophy, sociology, critical theory. Then we had this whole art direction, everything about art and culture. And then we had the like STEM direction, technologies, hard science. And finally, we had this whole direction of practices. And one of our focuses was the life of the city, urban sociology, urban anthropology. And yes, like it was one of our focuses, like how all these 4 directions, how do they work and make a city together. And I used to joke that 2 years of working on this project were somewhat similar to doing a master's in urban development. Yeah.
The portal still exists?
Yes, it does exist. It switches off from time to time when it runs out of hosting prepayment, but then the crew that was running it after I left for another 2 years, like they do another payment and then the site is still on.
Okay, so just a note to our listeners that we're gonna, at the end of this, like we're gonna list all the links that we are mentioning now, so you can actually visit all of these things.
Yes. I was wondering if you could talk more about children's literature and how you decided to start your career, your like very like creative career as a published author with children's literature. What drew you to it? And I can see a smile when I'm asking you this question. So does that make you happy? What are your views on writing or being an author of children's
Books.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm smiling and I'm going to be very sincere with you. I have entered this field for a very wrong reason of thinking that because kids' books are so short, it's going to be easier and it's going to make me a published author faster.
Yes.
And that's how, yeah, that's how I started with it. But I've always had, I think, some presuppositions for this particular path because, first of all, like I was a book child from the very beginning, and I loved good kids' books, and I still love them, and I still have a treasure collection from my very childhood of the books that were most influential for me, and these were most often like non-fiction kids' books.
Yes.
But also like when I was adult already and when I realized what was going on in the language sphere, I realized how badly I lacked good kids books in Ukrainian because all of these books that I had as a child, they were imported from Russia and they were in Russian. My first ever kids book in Ukrainian was the fourth part of Harry Potter, so already like mid 2000s, I guess. Just because a Ukrainian publishing house managed to translate this part faster. And my parents are like, oh, it's already there. She reads Ukrainian. Let's buy her a Ukrainian book and see what happens.
Yes.
But I had all the previous parts in Russian. So, yeah. And yes, when I decided that I want like that publishing journal articles and whatnot is not enough for me, that I want my actual book, I started thinking of kids' books, first of all, because, yeah, shorter, probably needs less time, but also because I always had this, like, since the beginning of my writing career, I always had very much pleasure in the process of trying to explain complicated things in a simpler language. One of my very first article series was in a magazine called Fish. What I was doing there is I was basically picking some very complicated terms like entropy or rhizoma or stuff like this, and then I was trying to explain it in a very simple language so that it would become accessible. And it's a very enjoyable process for me in explaining complicated things in a simple manner. And of course, it is best fitted for kids' literature. And yes, and I went into my very first publishing contract in a very accidental manner. Like someone who I knew from Facebook reposted a post from someone who was working as a managing editor in a publishing house. And she wrote that they are inviting new authors because they had investors who wanted them to publish more books, but they did not have enough authors, and they were back then specializing in nonfiction, and they also wanted to develop a kids part of all of this. And I wrote to her and I told about myself and I offered from the spot a few topics for potential books. And because it was late 2020, of course, when I mentioned something about the history of vaccines, they're like, oh, but we want a whole book about vaccines in general and germs. It took more than a year for me to finalize this 64 pages. And then it was scheduled for printing in March 2022. And then, of course, it did not happen. And honestly, I thought I will never see it in paper because, who will care about it now? But no, they resumed printing in summer already, and I'm very grateful for this. And the book came out in autumn 2022. I still have several exemplaries at home, and some kids read it. I collaborated with some charity funds so that it was distributed to libraries. I would do everything in a different way now, but I'm happy it exists. But after I already took this pressure of becoming a published author off my shoulders, I actually started realizing what is so good and so joyful about kids' literature, how you can create amazing stories, amazing characters. And honestly, they do not need to be so socially, politically, culturally intertwined to what's going on with your country because, kids need some relaxation and just good stories. And yes, and now I'm like, my approach has changed completely. I'm developing a couple of stories. I also have a book that is finished already now. I'm searching for its publisher. And I actually started writing fiction. I was afraid of fiction for quite a long time. And
Why?
because I've been preparing myself for writing nonfiction for several years as a journalist, and I've grown really skilled about it. But with fiction, it's like you have to create, like with nonfiction, you are just speaking about the world that is already out there, about a part of a world. And with fiction, you need to create this whole world and also tell about it and make it convincing and emotional. Yeah, but yeah, I've started finding joy in it as well, and now I'm writing fiction and very happy about it.
Okay, besides fiction, I mean, we also can talk a bit about your scholarly career, maybe. I really wanted, so when we had a previous conversation and when we were preparing for this recording, we were talking about your text that is published in the glossary, am I right?
Yeah, decolonial glossary, Ukrainian decolonial
Yeah,
glossary.
so I would like you to tell us something about it. And also I wanted to ask you, because you have that text there on minoritarian performance, so maybe to tell to our listeners something about the glossary and about your text as well. Especially for me, it was interesting how you found a way to explain relationship between Europeans and Europeanness with Ukrainians, where the Ukraine is perceived as some sort of an interior other within Europe. So maybe you can tell us something more about that, about the expectations, about maybe some sort of exoticism that is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Decolonial Glossary is a Ukrainian project supported by House of Europe, which entails creation of 20, if I'm not wrong, yes, 20 like vocabulary entries that were published in Ukrainian and English. So it's a bilingual project explaining basically a chosen terms from decolonial theory and nearby fields of scholarship, let's say, which are useful, first of all, for Ukrainians themselves to familiarize themselves with what colonialism is, what coloniality is, and how it can be explained, and what are its manifestations in our case. Yes, and it's also, of course, it's very useful to explain maybe some Europeans, like why some things are wrong. And I've chosen for this project the term by Jose Munoz, minoritarian performance, which depicts how minorities, subalterns are forced to perform their subalternity, forced to entertain someone's superior in these colonial hierarchies. Why I have chosen this term? Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of Munoz, and I feel very sorry that he is no longer here. I would love to meet him. But also this minoritarian performance is something that, it is a small term, but I see it happening a lot when all the time, especially in the very initial phases of the war. I'm not sure if it's still such an issue now, but when people are encouraged to talk in these very emotional terms about their experiences and their pain. And this was especially horrible with some of the Western journalists coming to Ukraine and asking someone who has lost a friend, for instance, or a loved one, asking, can you tell us what are you feeling right now? I don't know, switch on your imagination. I mean, sure, you want audience and reposts and whatnot, but I don't know, try to be human for once. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting a bit angry. Yes, but... And with this
Don't feel sorry.
Yeah, and this minoritarian performance, even when I was talking to my LGBTQI plus respondents for my masters, they were like many of them who are now in Europe keep telling about how they are coerced into these small talks and it's interesting because there is such a contrast. Like people in the West are very respectful to their queer identities. Like they will never ask something like, also you are transgender, what's the situation in your trousers? Something like this. And unfortunately, this is something that can happen in Ukraine. But as long as people learn that this transgender person is from Ukraine, and I'm telling a real example from my study, they are starting to ask questions. So what do you think about Putin? Or is your house still standing? Or did anyone of your relatives die? Or something like this. And yeah, and it's important to know this because it actually shows how Ukrainian people are not taken as equal. And it's a very important debate because I think the regional scholarship, the colonial scholarship, I'm definitely not the only person to think that, it was not ready for what happened because Ukrainians are mostly phenotypically white, and it was very hard to explain, like, why should Russian aggression be seen as an act of colonialism, and why the way Ukrainians are sometimes treated in the West, why it should be seen as an act of Eurocentrism. Because everyone was like, oh, like, Russians are white, Ukrainians are white, like, why should the colonial theories be talking about it? It's all different. But no, it's not. It's definitely a very different situation from what was happening in America or in Africa. Of course, it's a different situation, but it doesn't mean that it should not be talked about in terms of colonialism. I hope I managed to answer your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You're constantly switching languages when you're writing, so your academic career is mostly in English. Your studies, like your elementary studies, let's say, were in Ukrainian, then you studied in Russian. Now you use German. I'm interested how these things are functioning for you when you're writing.
Oh, okay. Sometimes these things mess up what I call my language module completely, and I start making very stupid mistakes in every language I'm trying to write in, because especially English and German, they mess up with each other real bad.
Yes.
And yeah, generally, I would say yes. If we are talking about my creative writing, it tended to be very different. Because when I was writing, especially when I started out with kids' texts in Ukrainian, I had this very reserved image of what a kids writer can be and how they should present themselves, how I should present myself as a kids writer. And also when you're doing this with a publishing house right from the start, like there are requirements for this very published and I would say sterile even language, especially for kids nonfiction. And when I arrived in Austria and I think already after my master's, I started engaging with local literary circles. I started attending Queer Writers Circle, which is a great literary community here in Vienna. And I started doing some creative writing in English as well, not only academic writing for the sake of establishment and survival here in Austria. Yeah, when I started writing things for fun, I opened up some very, I would say, unhinged sites of Eugenia the writer. Sonia Zelena is an embodiment of this very sanitized kids writer who is so perfect and normative that she is not even real.
Yes.
And yeah, maybe I will just drop her and write some wild stuff. I have recently submitted a short story it's a contest for an anthology. I'm not sure if it gets published, but I have submitted a story about a young Ukrainian vampire and how he suffers because of the full-scale war. And there are like also many kind of wild things going on there, so we'll see.
It is interesting to me now when you're talking about your different identities and now killing Sonia Zelena. It seems to me that you're going towards, let's say, some sort of unification of your different selves. So maybe you can tell us something more, because your MA thesis was about the sense of belonging of LGBTIQ plus people. So maybe you can give us a glimpse into your own sense of belonging. Or maybe not belonging, but maybe different layers of your identity.
Also, just to add to this, do you think all of this non-sanitized writing brings you closer maybe to your queerer self, or is it just you finally like starting to unleash or
Yes.
that part of you? Like, I don't know,
Yes,
is it
yes,
connected?
yes. I
All of
think it is. When I thought when I thought I could not approach my queer side any more than I already did, because okay, I'm living in this very rainbow country with my partner very openly. But no, I actually am approaching this more, and I realized like when I was writing this this short story with vampires,
Yes.
it was actually like I'm not he's not gay. He has this sort of heterosexual crush on his neighbor, which leads him to death.
You're going to spoil the story before it is published.
Yeah, but I realize that this is a very gay story, and vampires are very gay characters, and I love vampires, and this might be my next bigger work, because I'm very interested in what could happen to vampires in the wartime Ukraine, and no one seems to talk about it, and I want to write about it. And yeah, it's a very gay story, and even though it has these hints of heterosexuality, I needed to open some very gay part of me, the part that I never even had, gay 1980s erasure, New York Broadway travesty gay. But I have opened sort of it. Yeah. And speaking about other layers of identity and belonging, I'm not an ethnic Ukrainian. I have maybe 1/8 of Ukrainian blood, and we are not sure because my grandfather was homeless in an orphanage. We don't know who were his parents. Yes, but also from my mother's part, I have Korean and Tatarian origins. So my ancestors on my maternal side lived in, we believe, Southern Korea. And then they fled to Far East Russia in the beginning of the 20th century because there was war with Japan and there was famine, and they fled. And from there, they were displaced by Stalin's order in 1943, I want to say, 44 maybe. Yeah, and yes, they were displaced to Central Asia. And this is where my mother was born, and later she moved to Ukraine for her studies. And this is a very important part of my ancestry for me, and I did not relate to it for a very long time, but I started relating to it more as I grew older. And speaking of creativity and stuff like this, I actually think that I have this sub-identity of a middle-aged Korean man. It is a man. I am cisgender woman, but I have this sub-identity of a Korean man who gives me all these very crazy ideas, what if your periods were delivered to you in an envelope in the form of tiny red women who would be, as you open the envelope, run into your uterus, giggling and dancing, and then they would be raving there for 5 days straight, falling one by one, exhausted, until last of them drops. And what if you were used to living like this, and then one day, what if the envelope would not come? What would you do next? I have this inner Korean man who actually provides me with these ideas, I think, and yeah.
But that's him, definitely.
Yes, I think so. I came to this realization when it did not come to me out of nowhere. I was watching the YouTube videos, the Gangnam Style dude, but then also some others who are too crazy to be introduced to the Western audience. And I'm watching, and I'm like, okay, I know you.
Yes.
Like, I hear your voice in my head all the time. Thank you.
Oh my God, I love this. And also, I don't know, somehow this reminds me of queer theorist Eve Sedgwick because she said that she identifies as a gay man. And somehow, I don't know, to me, it made sense. And just your writing and this part of you, I think it's just a manifestation of queer joy and it counteracts
The expectations.
expectations and then that sort of like flattened narrative that Western media is trying to create of how a Ukrainian person is.
Thank you very much for being in with us and for listening to us. Eugenia, thank you very much for being our guest.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure.
And I have to say that it was also a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm very grateful for this invitation. And I will listen to what comes out of it, and also looking forward for the next episodes. And I'm very interested in whom are you going to invite and what they will talk about. Thank you.
Goodbye until the next podcast.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.